There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary. They wear the camouflage of a Tuesday night, or a simple question, or the tired sigh of a friend. You don't recognize them as hinges upon which your entire world will swing. You simply live them, and it is only in looking back that you see the stark, indelible line that was drawn. For me, that moment was the sound of Julian's voice, rough with exhaustion, asking a question so simple it should have meant nothing. He was standing in my doorway, backlit by the hallway light, his shoulders slumped from a week of travel and client meetings that had clearly worn him down to the bone. He had just come over for what had become our routine dinner, a silent agreement that neither of us wanted to eat alone. And as he was about to leave, he paused, his hand on the doorknob, and turned back. "Hey," he'd said, his voice quiet, almost hesitant. Would it be weird if I just crashed on your couch tonight? I'm so tired I don't think I can make it up the stairs to my own bed." And in that moment, my heart, which had been beating a steady, quiet rhythm for him for over a decade, stuttered. It wasn't the question itself. It was the space around it, the unspoken plea for something more than just a place to sleep. It was the beginning of a long, quiet season of pretending and the most honest moment of my life. I had known Julian since I was 7 years old. He was the boy next door, not in a storybook sense, but in the very real, tangible way of scraped knees and shared comic books and a fence that was more suggestion than barrier. His family moved into the house to the left of mine on a sweltering August afternoon. I watched from my bedroom window, a shy, observant kid, as this whirlwind of energy tumbled out of a minivan. He had a mop of unruly brown hair that defied gravity and a grin that seemed to take up his whole face. He was all motion and noise, a stark contrast to my world of quiet observation and carefully shaded drawings. He saw me watching him from behind the curtain and, without a moment's hesitation, he waved, a big, clumsy, enthusiastic gesture that made me duck back as if I'd been caught doing something wrong. An hour later, he was at my front door, holding a half-melted popsicle and asking if I wanted to see the fort he was planning to build in the giant oak tree that straddled our properties. That was Julian. He didn't just enter a room. He fundamentally changed its geometry, pulling everyone into his orbit. That oak tree became our kingdom. The fort was less a feat of engineering and more a collection of mismatched boards and a tattered old quilt for a roof. But from up there, we could see the whole world, or at least our small corner of it. We spent entire summers in its branches, trading secrets that felt monumental at the time. He told me about his fear of thunderstorms, and I confessed that I sometimes filled my sketchbooks with drawings of imaginary birds because I was too scared to try and draw real people. He never laughed. He just nodded, his expression serious, and said that my birds looked like they could really fly. He was the sun to my shade, the wind to my still water. He taught me how to throw a baseball without feeling like my arm would fall off, and I taught him how to be still, how to sit and watch the clouds morph from dragons to ships without needing to say a word. Our friendship was forged in that easy, uncomplicated language of childhood, a bond that felt as natural and as permanent as the roots of that old oak. We navigated adolescence side by side, our friendship a constant, steady anchor in the turbulent waters of high school. He became a star on the soccer field, his natural energy and charisma finding a perfect outlet. He was popular, surrounded by friends, always at the center of the laughter. I found my own place behind the lens of a camera, becoming the quiet observer who documented it all. I was the team photographer, the yearbook editor, always on the periphery, watching. And I watched Julian. I watched the way he'd run a hand through his hair when he was frustrated, the way his eyes would crinkle at the corners when he genuinely smiled, the unconscious way he'd seek me out in a crowd, his gaze finding mine for just a second, a small, silent check-in that no one else would ever notice. It was during those years that the simple, clean lines of our friendship began to blur for me. The comfortable affection I'd always felt for him began to deepen, to color itself with shades of something more complicated, something that made my stomach twist and my palms sweat whenever he'd sling an arm around my shoulders in a casual, thoughtless gesture of camaraderie. I knew, with a certainty that was both terrifying and absolute, that I was in love with him. It wasn't a sudden revelation. It was a slow dawn, a gradual realization that had been creeping over the horizon of my heart for years. It was in the ache I felt when he talked about a girl he liked, a hollow space in my chest that I would quickly paper over with supportive smiles and encouraging words. It was in the way I saved the photographs I took of him, not just the action shots for the school paper, but the candid ones, him laughing with his teammates, his face tilted towards the sun, him looking thoughtful on the bus ride home from an away game, the landscape blurring past the window. These were for me. They were fragments of a story I was telling only to myself, a secret history of my own heart. I buried the feeling deep, building walls around it made of casual jokes and brotherly pats on the back. I became an expert in the architecture of self-preservation. My love for him was a room inside me that I never unlocked, a place I visited only when I was alone, in the quiet of my darkroom or the solitude of my bedroom at night. To risk that friendship, that steady, foundational part of my life, for a feeling he would never understand or return, it was unthinkable. It would have been like taking a sledgehammer to the oak tree, destroying the very thing that had sheltered us for so long. When we graduated, the inevitable parting of ways felt like a physical tear. He was going to a big university on the other side of the country on a soccer scholarship, his future bright and loud and full of promise. I was staying, attending the local college to study fine arts and photography, choosing the familiar comfort of home. Our goodbye was awkward and hurried, standing on his lawn next to a car packed to the brim with his entire life. We hugged, a quick, hard embrace that felt both too long and not long enough. He promised to call, to text, to not become a stranger. And he kept that promise. For the next 10 years, our friendship existed in pixels and sound waves. We lived parallel lives, connected by late-night phone calls where he'd tell me about his classes, his team, the parties, the girlfriends. He dated a girl named Sarah for 3 years, a kind, intelligent art history major he brought home one Christmas. She was lovely, and I hated myself for the cold knot of jealousy that tightened in my stomach when I saw the easy way he held her hand. I was his constant, his touchstone to home. I was the friend he called when he was stressed about finals, when he had a fight with Sarah, when he was unsure about a job offer. I listened, I offered advice. I was the steady, reliable Leo the first had always been. I built a life for myself. I graduated, started a small photography business, shooting weddings and local events, but my real passion was landscape and portrait work. I found a quiet contentment in my routine, in the solitude of my work. But always, underneath it all, there was a Julian-shaped space, a low, persistent hum of longing that never quite went away. Then came the shift. It started with a phone call late one night, about a year ago now. His voice was different, frayed at the edges. He and Sarah had broken up. It wasn't dramatic, he explained. It was just a slow erosion. Their lives were heading in different directions. He was a consultant now, a job that had him living out of a suitcase, constantly flying from one city to another. She wanted to settle down, to put down roots. He said he felt like he was running a race with no finish line. The breakup was the catalyst, but the problem, I could tell, was deeper. He was adrift. The bright, confident energy that had always defined him was muted, replaced by a profound weariness that traveled through the phone line and settled heavily in my chest. He sounded lost. A few months after that call, another one came. He was quitting his job. He was done with the constant travel, the impersonal hotel rooms, the feeling of living a life that wasn't his own. He was coming home, not just for a visit. He was moving back. He'd found a short-term rental online, a small house he could stay in while he figured out his next move. It was just a coincidence, he'd said, a happy accident, that the house for rent happened to be the one right next door to his childhood home. The one right next door to me. The day he moved back, it felt like the past decade had just collapsed in on itself. I stood on my porch, watching him unload boxes from a truck, and it was like no time had passed at all. He looked older, of course. There were fine lines around his eyes I hadn't seen in person before, a certain tension in his shoulders that hadn't been there when he was a carefree college kid. But the way he moved, the way he tossed his head back to get his hair out of his eyes, it was all so painfully, wonderfully familiar. He saw me, and his tired face broke into that old, familiar grin, the one that still had the power to make my breath catch in my throat. We fell back into our old rhythm with an ease that was almost startling. It was as if our friendship had been cryogenically frozen, perfectly preserved, waiting for him to return. But something was different. The boy who left had been a supernova of confidence. The man who returned was quieter, more subdued. He was searching for something, an anchor, and without realizing it, he had sailed right back into the safest harbor he had ever known. That first night, we ordered pizza and sat on my living room floor, surrounded by his half-unpacked boxes that had migrated over to my house. He talked about his job, the burnout, the crushing loneliness of waking up in a different city every week. I felt disconnected, he said, staring at a piece of crust in his hand, like I was just a collection of boarding passes and hotel key cards. I didn't feel like a real person anymore. There was a vulnerability in him I had never seen before, a crack in the polished exterior he usually presented to the world. And in that moment, I felt the old walls I had so carefully constructed around my heart begin to crumble. He wasn't just my childhood friend anymore. He was a man, hurting and lost, and he had come to me. The old instinct to protect myself warred with a new, overwhelming urge to protect him, to offer him some kind of comfort, some kind of peace. It was a dangerous, intoxicating feeling. And so the ritual began, subtly at first, born out of convenience and a shared, unspoken loneliness. It started with dinner. His kitchen was still a mess of boxes, so it was just easier for him to eat at my place. I'd cook, something simple, and we'd eat at my small kitchen table, the silence between us as comfortable as the conversation. Then, dinner bled into the evening. We'd move to the living room, put on a movie, or just talk. I learned to read the new landscape of his moods. I could see the exhaustion etched into the lines of his face, the anxiety that sometimes flickered in his eyes when he thought I wasn't looking. He was a ship without a rudder, and my quiet, stable house became his port in the storm. I became a student of his presence, cataloging the small ways he filled the space. The way he'd leave his shoes by the door, the sound of his sigh as he sank into my worn-out armchair, the faint scent of his soap that lingered in the air after he left. My home, which had for so long been a fortress of solitude, started to feel like a shared territory. It was terrifying. It was wonderful. Then came the night he first asked to stay. He blamed it on exhaustion, and I accepted the excuse because it was easier than acknowledging the current of need that ran beneath his words. I gave him a pillow and the thick quilt from my spare room, and I went upstairs to my own bed, my mind racing. I lay there for hours, listening for the creak of the floorboards, the soft rustle of the blanket, the sound of his breathing from the floor below. The knowledge of his presence in my house was a physical thing, a weight and a warmth that settled over me. It was a form of exquisite torture. I was so close to the one thing I wanted most in the world, and yet we were separated by an impassable chasm of unspoken truths. In the morning, I came downstairs to find him already gone, the quilt folded neatly on the arm of the couch. There was just a small indentation left in the cushion, the ghost of his presence. A part of me was relieved, another part, a hollow, aching part, was disappointed. But it happened again a few nights later, and then again the week after that. Crashing on the couch became a regular occurrence, a part of our new routine. He always had a reason. A long, stressful day of job hunting. A headache he couldn't shake. The simple, honest admission that he just didn't want to be alone in that quiet, empty house next door. Each time, my heart would perform the same frantic, hopeful, terrified gymnastics. I would pretend it was nothing, just a friend helping a friend. I would hand him the pillow and quilt, say goodnight, and retreat to the safety of my room, where I would lie awake, every nerve ending tingling with the awareness of him being just downstairs. The couch became a liminal space, a piece of furniture that existed in the gray area between friendship and something else. It was a silent testament to our shared loneliness, a physical manifestation of his need and my willingness to meet it, no matter the cost to my own peace of mind. My photography became my only outlet. I couldn't photograph him, not anymore. It felt too intimate, too revealing. The camera had always been a shield for me, a way to observe without participating, but to point my lens at him now would be to admit everything. It would be like aiming a weapon loaded with all my secret confessions. Instead, I turned to landscapes. I drove out to the coast, to the forests, seeking out scenes that mirrored my own internal state. I photographed fog rolling in over a still lake, the way it blurred the lines between water and sky, creating a world of beautiful, aching ambiguity. I photographed trees in winter, their bare branches stark and vulnerable against a pale sky. I was trying to capture the feeling of waiting, of standing on a precipice, of holding your breath in a silence that is so full it feels like a sound. My work became more honest, more raw than it had ever been. I was pouring all the words I couldn't say to Julian into the light and shadow of my images. The ritual escalated on a cold night in November. A storm was raging outside, the kind of violent, thunderous squall that used to send Julian scrambling for comfort when we were kids. He had come over for dinner, looking more haggard than I'd ever seen him. He'd had a promising job interview that had gone poorly, and the rejection felt like a personal failure. He was quiet all through dinner, pushing food around his plate. Later, as we sat in the living room, the rain lashing against the windows, he was jumpy, his gaze distant. When the first loud crack of thunder shook the house, he flinched, a barely perceptible tightening of his shoulders, but I saw it. I had spent a lifetime learning to read his every subtle shift in mood. The boy who was afraid of thunderstorms was still in there, buried beneath the weary man. When it was late and the storm showed no signs of letting up, I knew he would ask to stay. But this time, when I brought out the quilt, he just stared at it. He looked small, lost on my oversized couch. He looked up at me, his eyes dark with something I couldn't quite decipher. It looked like shame or fear. "Leo," he started, his voice barely a whisper. "I know this is going to sound stupid, but I really hate thunderstorms." It was a confession, delivered with the same vulnerability as when he was 8 years old and hiding in our oak tree fort. In my bedroom, the window is huge. It feels like the whole storm is right there in the room with me. He didn't have to say the rest. I knew what he was asking, and the implications of it sent a jolt of pure, terrifying electricity through my veins. He was asking to cross a line, to step out of the gray area of the couch and into the undeniable intimacy of my personal space. The silence stretched between us, filled only with the drumming of the rain and the frantic beating of my own heart. I could have said no. I could have offered him the spare room, a perfectly reasonable, platonic alternative. It would have been the safe thing to do, the self-preservationist thing. But when I looked at his face, at the genuine fear and loneliness etched there, I found that I couldn't. The part of me that had loved him for so long, the part that wanted nothing more than to offer him comfort, was stronger than the part that was terrified of getting hurt. "My bed's big enough," I said, my voice sounding much calmer than I felt. "You can take the side by the wall." The relief that flooded his face was so profound it was almost painful to watch. It was as if I had thrown a lifeline to a drowning man. He nodded, a quick, grateful gesture, and followed me upstairs. The journey up the stairs and into my bedroom felt momentous, each step a deliberate move into uncharted territory. My room had always been my sanctuary, the one place that was entirely my own. And now he was in it. He moved with a kind of hesitant reverence, as if he understood the sanctity of the space he was entering. I gave him an old t-shirt and a pair of sweatpants to sleep in, and I turned away while he changed, my back to him, staring at a framed photograph on my wall, a black and white shot of a foggy coastline. I could hear the soft rustle of clothes, and I focused on my breathing, trying to keep it even. "This is just a friend," I told myself. "A friend who is scared and needs a safe place to be. It's not anything more than that." But my body betrayed me. A fine tremor ran through my hands, and I knew I was lying to myself. We got into bed like two strangers navigating a minefield. We kept a careful, deliberate distance between us, a wide, empty continent of mattress separating our bodies. We both lay on our backs, staring up at the ceiling, the darkness of the room thick and heavy around us. The only light came from the occasional flash of lightning, which would momentarily illuminate the space, casting our still forms in stark relief before plunging us back into darkness. I was acutely aware of everything. The scent of the rain on his clothes, the subtle dip in the mattress from his weight, the sound of his breathing, a slow, steady rhythm that was so close, so real, it felt like a part of my own body. We didn't speak for a long time. The silence was charged, filled with all the things we weren't saying. I felt like a tightly wound spring, every muscle in my body tensed. I was terrified that if I moved, if I even breathed too deeply, I would shatter the fragile truce of the moment. I was so focused on my own internal chaos that I almost didn't notice when his breathing began to even out, to deepen into the slow, rhythmic cadence of sleep. He had found his harbor. He had fallen asleep, and I was left wide awake, adrift in a sea of my own making, guarding his peace at the expense of my own. This, too, became a new part of the ritual. It wasn't every night, but on the bad days, on the nights when the loneliness seemed to press in on him, or when he was exhausted from a day of dead-end job applications, a quiet understanding would pass between us. He wouldn't have to ask anymore. I would just see the look in his eyes, and I would nod towards the stairs. He would sleep in my bed. We created a set of unspoken rules to govern this new, dangerous territory. We always kept our backs to each other. We never touched. We never spoke of it in the morning. We would wake up, and he would slip out of the room while I was in the shower, and when I came downstairs, he would be in the kitchen making coffee, acting as if he had just walked over from his own house. It was a masterful performance of platonic friendship, a carefully constructed play we were both starring in. But the pretense was wearing thin. The line between acting and feeling was blurring. The space between our bodies in the dark felt less like a protective boundary and more like a charged void, humming with a tension that was becoming unbearable. I lived for those nights, and I dreaded them in equal measure. The proximity to him was a slow, sweet poison. I would lie there, my back to his, and I would imagine what it would be like to just turn over, to close the distance between us, to reach out and rest my hand on his arm. The fantasy was so vivid, so powerful, that sometimes I would have to physically clench my fists to keep myself from doing it. I was terrified of misreading the situation, of mistaking his need for comfort for a desire for me. What if this was just what it appeared to be? A man leaning on his oldest friend during a difficult time. If I were to cross that line, to introduce the messy, complicated truth of my feelings into our fragile ecosystem, I could destroy everything. I would not only lose the future I secretly dreamed of, but I would also shatter the past, tainting 15 years of friendship with my own selfish desires. The risk was too great, and so I remained still, a silent sentinel in the dark, guarding a secret that was slowly, inexorably consuming me. One evening, he came over with a bottle of wine and a look of quiet celebration on his face. He'd gotten a job. It was a consulting position with a firm based in the city, an hour's drive away. The best part, he explained, was that it was a hybrid role. He would only have to go into the office 2 or 3 days a week. He could keep living here. He could stay. He was so happy, so relieved, the old Julian shining through for the first time in months. We celebrated, finishing the whole bottle of wine between us, talking and laughing with an ease we hadn't shared in a long time. It felt good. It felt normal. But as the night wore on, a cold dread began to seep into my veins. His crisis was over. He had a job. He had a purpose again. He wouldn't need me anymore. The ritual would end. The nights on the couch, the silent sharing of my bed, they had been a temporary measure, a port in a storm. But the storm was passing, and his ship would be sailing on, leaving me alone on the shore. That night, he didn't go home. The wine, the celebration, it was reason enough. We fell into our familiar positions in my bed, back to back, the silence between us feeling different this time. It wasn't fraught with tension, but with a kind of melancholy. It felt like an ending. I lay there, my heart a heavy, aching stone in my chest, trying to memorize the feeling of his presence beside me. I was certain it would be the last time. I was preparing myself for the loss, steeling myself for the return to my quiet, solitary life. I must have drifted off, because the next thing I knew, I was awake, but the quality of the darkness had changed. Something was different. It took me a moment to realize what it was. He had moved. He was no longer on his side of the bed. He had turned over. I could feel the warmth of his body just inches from my back. My own body went rigid. I held my breath, listening. I could hear his breathing, soft and even, but it wasn't the deep, slow rhythm of sleep. He was awake. He was awake, and he had deliberately, intentionally, closed the space between us. My mind was a chaotic storm of questions. What did this mean? Was I imagining it? Was he just shifting in his sleep? But then, I felt it. The slightest, most tentative pressure against my back. He had moved closer still, his chest now barely brushing against my shoulder blades. The contact, after months of careful distance, was like a lightning strike. A jolt of pure, unadulterated shock, and a terrifying, soaring hope shot through me. We stayed like that for what felt like an eternity, two statues in the dark, connected by the smallest, most fragile of bridges. Every nerve in my body was screaming. I could feel the heat radiating from him, could almost feel the beat of his heart against my own back. The silence was deafening. And then, his voice, a rough, broken whisper that was barely audible, cut through the darkness. Leo, my name. Just my name. But the way he said it, it was filled with a universe of uncertainty and fear and longing. It was the sound of a man standing on the edge of a cliff. I couldn't speak. I could only manage a small, questioning hum in the back of my throat. I felt him take a shaky breath. I can't sleep. It was an excuse, and we both knew it. It was a flimsy pretext for what was really happening, a way to test the waters without having to dive in. I knew, in that moment, that I had a choice. I could pretend to be asleep. I could roll away, reinstating the boundary, and in the morning we could both pretend this never happened. I could choose safety, or I could choose the truth. I could turn around. After a decade of hiding, of self-preservation, of living in the quiet shadows of my own heart, I found I was tired of being safe. Slowly, deliberately, I turned over to face him. In the faint moonlight filtering through the window, I could just make out the shape of his face. His eyes were wide, luminous in the dark, and they were fixed on mine. The space between us was now almost non-existent, a few inches of charged air. I could feel his breath on my cheek. He looked terrified. He looked more vulnerable than I had ever seen him, more so than on the night of the storm, more so than when he'd told me about his breakup. This was a different kind of vulnerability. This was the terror of standing before another person without any pretense, without any shield. And I realized, with a sudden, gut-wrenching clarity, that he was just as scared as I was. He wasn't the confident, unknowing initiator I had always cast him as in my mind. He was just Julian, lost and confused and feeling something he didn't understand. "What's wrong?" I whispered, the words feeling thick and clumsy in my mouth. He shook his head, a small, almost imperceptible movement. His gaze dropped from my eyes to my mouth, and then back up again. The air crackled. The world seemed to shrink until it was only the space between our two faces. "Would it be," he started, his voice cracking. He swallowed hard and tried again. "Would it be okay if I kissed you?" The question hung in the air between us, so fragile it felt as though a single breath could shatter it. It was not a demand. It was not a proposition. It was a plea. It was a question that handed me all the power, that laid his own heart bare at my feet. Would it be okay? He was asking for permission. He was giving me the choice to destroy him. And in that one, simple, terrifying question, I saw everything. I saw the years of unspoken affection, the carefully guarded friendship, the fear, the loneliness, the desperate, human need to be seen, to be held, to be truly known. He wasn't asking for my body. He was asking for my heart. And I, who had guarded it so fiercely for so long, found that I could not deny him. I didn't answer with words. I simply closed the remaining distance between us and pressed my lips to his. The kiss was not what I had imagined in my countless daydreams. It was not passionate or demanding or cinematic. It was tentative. It was hesitant. It was unbelievably soft. It was a question and a confession and an apology all at once. It was the taste of wine and salt, the latter of which I realized with a start were from the tears that had begun to silently stream down his face. It was clumsy and uncertain and perfect. It was the feeling of a lock finally clicking open after a decade of being rusted shut. We broke apart, our foreheads resting against each other, both of us breathing as if we had just run a marathon. He let out a shaky, shuddering sob, a sound of such profound relief and terror that it broke my heart. I wrapped my arms around him, pulling him close, and he buried his face in my shoulder, clinging to me as if I were the only solid thing in a spinning world. And I just held him. I held him through the storm that had finally broken, not outside in the sky, but inside of him, inside of us. There were no more words. There was no need for them. For the first time, in the quiet darkness of my room, there was only the beautiful, honest, terrifying truth. The morning after was a landscape of blinding sunlight and deafening silence. I woke up first, a feat in itself, as I was usually the one who slept in. I was on my side, and Julian was curled against my back, one of his arms thrown loosely over my waist, his breathing a warm, steady presence against my neck. For a few blissful, disoriented seconds, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. It felt like waking up to a truth I had always known. Then, memory crashed down on me. The conversation, the question, the kiss, the tears. And with memory came anxiety, a cold, creeping dread that coiled in the pit of my stomach. What now? What did this mean? The man sleeping beside me was not a stranger. He was the bedrock of my life, the keeper of my entire history. Last night, we had taken a sledgehammer to the foundation of everything we had ever been. I wasn't sure what, if anything, we could build in its place. I slipped out of bed as carefully as I could, trying not to wake him. He stirred, murmuring something in his sleep, but didn't wake. I stood there for a moment, just watching him. In the morning light, he looked younger, the lines of worry and exhaustion smoothed away by sleep. A lock of his unruly hair had fallen across his forehead, and I had to physically restrain my hand from reaching out and brushing it away. The urge to perform that small, simple act of tenderness was so overwhelming it felt like a physical ache. I turned and fled the room, retreating downstairs to the safety of the kitchen and the familiar ritual of making coffee. I needed the routine, the simple, mechanical steps to ground me. As the coffee maker gurgled to life, I leaned against the counter, my head in my hands. The fear was a living thing inside me, clawing at my insides. What if I had misread everything? What if last night was just a moment of drunken, emotional weakness on his part? A mistake he was already regretting. The thought was so agonizing I felt nauseous. When I heard his footsteps on the stairs, my entire body tensed. I braced myself. I turned around, a neutral, pleasant expression pasted on my face, a mask I had perfected over years of practice. He appeared in the kitchen doorway, wearing the t-shirt and sweatpants I'd given him. He wouldn't meet my eyes. He stared at the floor, at the cabinets, at the coffee maker, anywhere but at me. The easy intimacy of the night before had evaporated, replaced by an awkward, suffocating tension. The silence stretched, thick and unbearable. He looked like a cornered animal, poised for flight. "Coffee's almost ready," I said, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet room. I should go," he mumbled, still not looking at me. He took a step back, towards the front door. "I have stuff to do." Every word was a small, sharp blow to my chest. He was running. He was retreating back to the safety of his own house, back behind the walls of our old, comfortable friendship, pretending that the wrecking ball of last night had never happened. The hurt was so sharp, so immediate, it took my breath away. It was followed by a flash of anger, a rare and unfamiliar emotion for me when it came to Julian. Anger at his cowardice. Anger at myself for allowing a sliver of hope to take root in my heart. He was gone before the coffee finished brewing. I stood alone in my kitchen, listening to the sound of my front door closing, followed a moment later by the sound of his own front door shutting next door. The finality of those two sounds was like a verdict. The space between our houses, which had shrunk to nothing over the past few months, suddenly felt like a vast, uncrossable ocean. I poured a cup of coffee I no longer wanted and stared out the window at his house. The curtains were drawn. He had closed himself off. The beautiful, honest silence of the night before had been replaced by a new kind of silence. A cold, empty, desolate one. The next 3 days were some of the longest of my life. I existed in a state of suspended animation, a painful limbo of waiting. I didn't text him. I didn't call. I didn't go over. The ball was in his court, and his silence was a clear, unambiguous answer. He was choosing to erase it. He was choosing to pretend. I tried to work, to lose myself in editing the photos from my last trip to the coast, but the images of fog and blurred horizons felt like a cruel joke. My life had become the very thing I had been trying to capture, a world without clear lines or solid ground. Every time I heard a car door slam outside, or the sound of footsteps on the pavement, my heart would leap into my throat, hoping it was him, coming to talk, to explain, to apologize. But it never was. I saw him once, getting into his car to go to his new job. He moved quickly, his head down, and I knew he was deliberately avoiding the possibility of seeing me. He was treating me like a shameful secret, and the hope I had foolishly nurtured began to wither and die, replaced by a dull, persistent ache of resignation. I had been right all along. I had risked everything, and I had lost. On the 4th day, I couldn't take it anymore. The passivity, the waiting, it wasn't me. I had spent my life observing, but this was too important to just watch from the sidelines. The pain of not knowing, of living in this suffocating ambiguity, was worse than the pain of a definitive rejection. At least with rejection, I could begin the process of grieving, of healing. This was just an open wound. That evening, after I knew he would be home from work, I walked out my front door, across the small patch of lawn that separated our houses, and up the steps to his porch. My heart was hammering against my ribs so hard I thought it might break through. My hand trembled as I raised it to knock on the door. This was it. This was the confrontation I had been dreading, the one that would either save us or destroy us for good. He opened the door, and his face fell when he saw me. He had been expecting a package, a food delivery, anything but me. He tried to hide his surprise, but I saw the flicker of panic in his eyes. He stood in the doorway, partially blocking it, a clear, unspoken signal that I was not welcome inside. "Hey," he said, his voice strained. "Julian," I said, keeping my own voice as steady as I could. "We need to talk." He ran a hand through his hair, that old, familiar gesture of frustration. "Leo, I'm really tired. It's been a long day. Can we do this another time?" "No," I said, the word sharper than I intended. "We can't, because you'll just keep avoiding me. You'll keep pretending that the other night didn't happen. And I can't. I can't live like that." I took a breath, trying to soften my tone. "I deserve more than that. Our friendship, we deserve more than that." My words seemed to land, to break through his defensive shell. He looked down, his shoulders slumping in defeat. He finally stepped back, opening the door wider, and gestured for me to come in. His house was sparse, still feeling temporary. Boxes were stacked against one wall, and the furniture was minimal and impersonal. It didn't feel like a home. It felt like a waiting room. We stood in the middle of his living room, a few feet apart, the silence from my kitchen having followed me over here. He wouldn't look at me, his gaze fixed on a scuff mark on the hardwood floor. I finally broke the silence. "Why are you doing this, Julian? Why are you pretending it didn't happen?" He finally looked up, and his eyes were full of a desperate, panicked confusion. "Because I don't know what it was," he burst out, his voice raw. "I don't know what happened. I was drunk. I was emotional. It was a mistake, Leo. It shouldn't have happened, a mistake." The word was a physical blow. I felt the air leave my lungs. I had prepared myself for this, but hearing him say it, seeing the conviction in his terrified eyes, was a unique and devastating kind of pain. "A mistake," I repeated, my voice dangerously quiet. "So the last 3 months, you showing up at my door every night, you sleeping on my couch, you needing to be close. Was all of that a mistake too? No. That was different, he stammered, looking trapped. You're my best friend. I was going through a hard time. I needed my friend, and I needed mine. I shot back, the hurt finally boiling over into anger. But my best friend wouldn't kiss me like that, and then treat me like I don't exist for 4 days. My best friend wouldn't call what happened between us a mistake, as if it was something to be ashamed of. I am ashamed, he yelled, his voice cracking. Okay, I am. Because I don't know what this is. I'm not. He trailed off, unable to say the word. He paced the room like a caged animal, his hands tangled in his hair. All I know is that when I was with Sarah, when I was with anyone, I never felt safe. Not really. There was always a part of me I was holding back. But with you, especially these last few months, it was the first time I felt like I could just breathe. Like I was home. He stopped pacing and looked at me, his face a mask of anguish. And that scares the hell out of me, Leo. Because what does that make me? And in that moment, all my anger just dissolved. It evaporated, replaced by a wave of profound, aching empathy. I finally understood. He wasn't running from me. He was running from himself. He was running from a truth that threatened to upend his entire understanding of who he was. The kiss hadn't just been a line crossed between us. It had been a line crossed within him, and he didn't know how to get back. He wasn't rejecting me. He was terrified of what accepting this, would mean. I closed the distance between us, and this time, he didn't back away. I stood in front of him, and I spoke, my voice soft and clear. It makes you human, Julian. It doesn't have to have a label. It doesn't have to fit in a box. It's just us. I reached out, my hand hesitating for a fraction of a second before I gently touched his arm. He flinched, but he didn't pull away. All I know, I continued, my voice thick with emotion, is that for the last 10 years, I have been in love with you. And these last few months, having you so close, it has been the most wonderful and the most painful time of my life. And what happened the other night? That was not a mistake. Not for me. It was the most honest moment I've ever had. The confession hung in the air, my truth laid bare, a final, desperate offering. His eyes searched mine, and for the first time, the panic in them began to recede, replaced by a dawning sense of wonder. You love me? He whispered, as if the concept was too vast to comprehend. I nodded, a lump forming in my throat. I think I always have. A single tear traced a path down his cheek. He didn't wipe it away. He just stared at me, his expression shifting from fear to something else, something I couldn't name. It was relief. It was recognition. It was the look of a man who has been lost at sea for a very long time and has just, finally, spotted a lighthouse in the distance. He raised his own hand and covered mine, his fingers lacing through mine. His touch was no longer hesitant. It was firm. It was certain. I'm sorry, he whispered, his voice thick. I'm so sorry, Leo. I've been such an idiot. I was just so scared, I know. I said, my own tears starting to fall. Me too. We didn't need to say anything else. In that moment, holding hands in the middle of his empty living room, we had finally found our way back to each other. The storm had passed, the conflict was over, and the quiet that settled over us was not empty or cold, but full. It was full of possibility, of forgiveness, and of a fragile, tentative, beautiful new beginning. That night marked the end of the ritual of pretending and the beginning of the practice of being. We didn't go back to my house. We stayed at his, and we talked for hours, sitting on his uncomfortable, temporary couch. We unraveled a decade of unspoken feelings, of missed signals, of carefully constructed walls. I told him about the photographs I kept, the way my heart ached when he was with Sarah, the lonely years of loving him from a distance. He told me about the persistent feeling of not quite rightness in his past relationships, the deep, gnawing loneliness that no amount of success or travel could ever fill. He confessed that coming home, coming back to me, had been a subconscious act of seeking the only real comfort he'd ever known. He hadn't understood the shape of his own need until he had asked to kiss me, and the rightness of that moment had terrified him into retreat. It was a conversation that was years overdue, a painful but necessary lancing of a wound we had both carried for too long. When we finally fell silent, exhausted and emotionally raw, there was a new clarity between us. The ambiguity that had been our constant companion was gone, replaced by a quiet certainty. He stood up, took my hand, and led me to his bedroom. It was the first time I had ever been in it. It was as sparse as the rest of the house, but it didn't matter. That night, when we lay down, we didn't keep a careful distance. We didn't lie back to back. We faced each other, our legs tangled together, my hand resting on his chest, feeling the slow, steady beat of his heart beneath my palm. There was no pretense, no fear. There was only peace. For the first time, I fell asleep almost instantly, feeling safer and more at home than I ever had in my own bed. The days that followed were a process of gentle recalibration. We were learning a new language, a new way of being with each other. The large, dramatic gestures of romance you see in movies were absent. Our story was written in smaller, quieter moments. It was in the way he started leaving a toothbrush in my bathroom without asking. It was in the way I started buying the brand of coffee he liked. It was in the easy, domestic rhythm we fell into, cooking dinner together, his hand finding mine as we reached for the same spice, his arm wrapping around my waist as I stood at the sink. His house slowly started to feel more like a home, because my things started migrating over. A book left on his nightstand, my favorite mug in his cabinet, a framed photo of a foggy coastline that I hung on his living room wall. We were slowly, deliberately, merging our two separate worlds. The door between our houses, once a symbol of a boundary he had to cross to find comfort, became something different. It became a passage. We left it unlocked, a silent invitation. Sometimes I would wake up in my own bed and find him there, having let himself in during the night because he hadn't wanted to sleep alone. Other times, I would come home from a late shoot to find him asleep on my couch, not out of lonely desperation anymore, but out of a simple, comfortable habit, because my couch felt more like his than his own did. The couch was no longer a space of tension and yearning. It was just a place where one of us could wait for the other. The ghost of our old ritual remained, but it had been transformed into something new, something solid and real. A month after our conversation, we were lying in bed on a lazy Sunday morning, the sunlight streaming through the window, dust motes dancing in the beams. He was tracing patterns on my arm, a thoughtful expression on his face. "You know," he said quietly, "my lease is up in 2 months." I turned to look at him, my heart giving a familiar little flutter. "I was thinking," he continued, a small, shy smile playing on his lips. "It seems kind of stupid to be paying rent on a house I barely sleep in." He met my gaze, his eyes clear and direct. "What would you think about me not renewing it?" It was another one of his questions, simple on the surface, but holding the weight of a whole future within it. It was not a question of convenience. It was a question of permanence. It was him asking if he could finally, truly, come home. I didn't answer right away. I just leaned in and kissed him, a slow, deep kiss that was filled with all the certainty and peace that had been missing for so long. It was a kiss that said yes without needing the word. It said, "You are already home." When we pulled apart, I smiled. "I think," I said, "that my closet has more than enough room." The relief and joy that washed over his face was a beautiful thing to witness, the final banishment of the fear that had haunted him for so long. He was no longer adrift. He had found his anchor, and I was no longer the quiet observer, watching life from behind a lens. I was in the picture. I was a part of the story. There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary, and then there are the moments that follow, the quiet, unassuming moments that are the true substance of a life. They are the mornings spent making coffee together in a shared kitchen, the evenings spent in comfortable silence, the feeling of a familiar hand finding yours in the dark. We had spent so long navigating the treacherous currents of unspoken things, and now we had arrived in a calm, quiet harbor. The fear of ruining our friendship had been replaced by the profound, grounding peace of building a future upon its foundation. We began to heal, not in grand pronouncements or dramatic confessions, but in the beautiful, honest silence we had finally learned how to create together. A silence that was no longer empty, but full of the quiet, steady, and certain language of love.